to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, our topic will be the skewers. I mentioned it in several previous lessons already, but you can't hear it enough until it becomes obvious. And if it's so obvious, then probably it's a time for you to move on to the intermediate lessons. But in the meantime, I suggest you listen on and learn about all the skewers. So when you get the opportunity in your games, you'll know what to do. Well, let's get to it, and here is our very first example. The skewer happens when you see two enemy pieces on the very same file, rank, or diagonal. And that's the situations that we're going to see in this lesson, that in this case, everything is already unset. And in some others, we'll need to make some moves to make it happen, to force your opponent into it. In this case, you see the black king and queen being on the same C file, and all white needs to do is move the queen to C8. What happens now is that black is in a check, and while the king has a whole bunch of choices, namely 5 of them, where to go, none of them will help in protecting the queen that white can just capture. So our goal in this lesson is, in each and every example, to achieve a situation where the black king and queen will end up being in the same line of attack. And then we find the correct attack, and on the following move, boom, we capture the queen. Okay, ready to go? Let's see the next example. Here we go. In this situation, again, we already have the black king and queen ready. This time it's not a file but a diagonal. They are on the same diagonal, which would not be important if white would not have a bishop of that same color that in fact can go to a square on the diagonal. So for example, if the white bishop would be 1 square over on C2, then it would not matter. But in our current situation, it very much does matter. And after the white bishop appears on A3, checking the black king, forcing it to move away from the diagonal, that will result in the gain of the queen. Let's move on to the next example, which is going to be a bit more challenging, as in our situation here in position 3, we do not see the black king and queen being on the same line of attack. However, we can force them in being there. However, only if we find the correct sequence of moves. For example, moving the queen right now to E4 would give an invitation for the black king to move to D6, protecting the pawn on C6, and then allowing the skewer with queen F4. However, would also give an option for the black king to go to a whole bunch of other squares. For example, the king could move to D8. And then, even though the black king and queen are on the same rank, there is no way to win the black queen. Also, another check that looks tricky, queen H7, it is only tricky but not sufficient to win the queen. If now the black king would choose to move to the 8th rank to E8, then after queen H8, indeed, the black king would have no choice but move back to the 7th rank and give up on the queen. But again, it is a choice of blacks. So in this position, after queen H7, the black king can choose to move to a square that will avoid losing the queen. And namely, that square is to move to D8, and even though the black king and queen are on the same 8th rank, and white can give a check on the 8th rank, the king now is close enough to move to C7 and protect the queen. So after queen takes, king can take back, and white achieved nothing but exchanging queens. So looking at this position, what is the correct move? the correct move is the one that doesn't give black a choice. Attacks the king from f6, leaves black only one single legal option, moving the king to e8, and then allowing the check that ends up winning the queen. So as you can see, it's absolutely necessary at each and every move to try to look out for the best options for your opponent as well, not just your own good moves. Because unless you see the potential good moves for your opponent, you may pass upon an opportunity to win material because you think, oh, he's gonna fall for that, and what if he doesn't? Right? So therefore, you always want to be ready with your opponent's best options and still make your plan work. So that's the whole difference between a good player and an inexperienced player who is just setting up random traps instead of directing the situation where your opponent has no choice but needs to get into the skewer. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. In this position, again, the black king and queen are not yet on the same line. So how can we force the black king into a situation where it cannot avoid losing material? I suggest you try to work on it a little bit on your own now that you know what this chapter, this lesson is about. It's about skewers. It's about forcing the black king and queen onto the same line. The way we achieve it is queen c3. The king has only one legal move, moving to b5, and we achieved our goal. Now, either queen b2 or 3 would win the queen. Let's move on to the next example. Here we go. Again, in this tricky situation, the black queen is on an unprotected square, and that is a very important element in all these skewers that we're learning about, because if that queen would be protected by another pawn or bishop or piece, then even though white would give the check that seems to be a skewer, at the end of the day, the king moves out of the check, queen takes queen, and if another piece can recapture our queen, then we wouldn't achieve any gain. However, in all the examples we'll hear in this lesson, that will not be the case. If you find the correct sequence of checks, you can win the enemy queen. So in this case, the first correct check is check on f4. Now the black king has to choose between two unpleasant choices, c5 or d3. If the king moves to c5, can you see the skewer? Yes, it comes from f8. Or if the king moved to d3, then the skewer comes from the third rank, and again, queen takes queen, resulting with significant material gain. Let's move on to the next example. Here we go. Again, all we need to do is force the black king onto the same diagonal with the black queen. And we can do it with one well-placed check. Can you see that move? Yes, that check is queen d2, leaving black with only one option. Capture the pawn, and here we go. Mission accomplished. King moves, and we got the queen. Let's see the next example. Here we go. Wow, look at this position. Black has a full extra rook. The rook is protected. How is it possible that yet white can win this game? Well, I'll tell you how. Even without black making any further mistake, white, if he gives the right checks, forcefully can force the black king into a skewer. And again, black's big problem is that the queen is on an unprotected square. Now again, it's super important that you look out for the best moves of your opponent as well. For example, giving the check right now from a6 would miss the opportunity, even though if the king moves to d7, for example, you would accomplish the goal. Or after queen a6, if the king would move to e5, again you would accomplish the goal of skewer. However, you always need to look out for the best response of your opponent as well, not just your own good moves. And in this case, that would be moving the king to e7, even though it's on the same rank as the queen, but because they are so close to each other, now the king can protect the queen, and black is in a winning position. On the other hand, the correct move, queen c5, would give no option for black but to move down to the 7th rank to d7, only legal move, and then queen a7 accomplished the goal. As you can see, it's extremely important that you look out for the best response of your opponent. I cannot stress it enough. Let's move on to the next example. Here we go. Again, our goal is the same. We see the queen being in the corner unprotected, but the black king is not yet on that same diagonal or file. How do we force it there? That's the task. Well, in this case, we can achieve it real fast, but again, it's important that we give no option for black. We force black to that H file. For example, giving the check from D1 would invite the king to move to the H file and then give the skewer. However, by no means would queen D1 force the black king there. Black will have the option, and believe me, if we'll give an option for black, black will try to do everything to avoid getting there. So therefore, it's important to give the correct check, which is moving to e4. And now, whether the king moves to h3 or does it move to h5, the answer will be the same, queen h1, and the queen is falling. How about the next scenario, which is very similar to the previous one? How do we force the black king again onto the same line as the black queen is on? Well, in this case, we cannot force the king to the H file, but we can force the king onto the same long dark square diagonal as black's queen is on. The question is how? Again, as I said, invitation is not good enough. We need to leave no choice for black. For example, giving the check from c4 would be an invitation to move here and then skewer. However, black would have a choice, and black would choose to move the king to f5, avoiding it. So remember also from the other side, if you would have the black pieces in this position, make sure you watch out for the skewers and try to avoid as much as possible moving onto the same file, rank, or diagonal as your queen is on. Because you may have options you don't necessarily need to fall into, especially if your opponent gives you the option. The correct move is queen to f3, not leaving black a choice. Now the king has to move to e5, and then voila, skewer. King takes pawn, and queen takes queen, winning the queen. Okay, let's move on to our next example on the same theme. Here we go. In this position, black has significant material advantage, having an extra bishop, an extra pawn. Also, the black queen seems to be pretty close by the black king. So therefore, you may think that the black king can comfortably protect the queen. And it seems so, but isn't so. In this position again, white needs to try to force the king onto the same diagonal with Her Majesty. And the way to do that is to play queen b4. Now the tricky part here is that even though the black king can come real close to the queen, protecting it, after the skewer, queen b1, because the pawn on f2 guards the e3 square, and because of black's own pawn on d4, the king actually cannot do anything but leave the queen hanging. and then queen takes queen. White achieved the mission. Let's go back again to the starting position here and see what would happen if after queen b4 check, the king would choose to go the other way to d5. Well, same story from the other side. Queen b7, and again white's pawn from f4 prevents the black king from coming to e5, and the same d4 pawn prevents the black king to hanging on to the queen's hand. And after king moves, queen captures and white wins. Again, it's quite important again to notice that other checks, for example, a check from c7 would only invite the king to d5, but would give other options for the king, like going to b3 and no more skewers in sight. So always, always count on the best moves of your opponent. Don't just look out for your own good moves. Let's move on. Here we go. In this position, the black king and queen are already on the same diagonal. However, the white queen cannot easily give a skewer. Moving to d4 would be moving to an unprotected square, which means king captures queen, real bad idea. Moving the queen to e5 wouldn't really be a great idea either, because the black knight would capture our queen, and even though we result in a skewer, we ended up losing our queen, and after bishop takes the queen, the black pawn runs away and then gets promoted and ends up winning the game. On the other hand, finding the correct move here, we can still win the black queen as a full gain. The correct move is to give the check with the bishop. In this case, if the king moves out, of course, just queen takes queen, or if knight takes, then queen takes, and we achieved our goal of the skewer. Let me just go on a couple of more moves here. After queen takes a1, black still has a pass pawn. However, the big difference now is that unlike when we had a bishop in the corner, which was incapable of stopping a pawn about to promote on a light square, our queen, of course, is very capable of stopping it. In fact, can and should move right away to the corner, not only stopping the pawn from promoting, but attacking it and then capturing it the next move around. So going back to this position, the idea here is to making sure we give the skewer with the less valuable piece, and then after the exchange bishop for knight, then only our queen gets to the same e5 square and captures the queen for free. And here is our final example for this lesson. Right now, black has a huge material advantage, extra bishop, extra 2 pawns. But just like we saw in all our other examples in this lesson, if black ends up losing the queen, white all of a sudden will have a significant material advantage. And this example is no different. Again, what white needs to accomplish is to force the black king onto the same file, the F file, where the black queen is at. And again, it's really important that you do not give options for black, because if white in this position would choose to give a check on e1, black could move to the F file and allow the skewer, also could choose to, and if you're black, I hope you would choose to, avoid it and move the other direction, far away from being on the same file with your own queen. And then you would be safe. Also remember, if it's the question to repeat moves and allow your opponent constantly keep checking you, it is still a better choice than ending up losing your queen and eventually the game. So one situation is when you don't mind the draw is when your only other option is to lose the game or lose your queen, which will end up giving your opponent a winning advantage. So in this case, you would rather repeat moves indeed and agree to a draw if your opponent chooses to constantly give the same checks, rather than going back to e4 and allow your opponent to win after the correct queen e2, which of course, going back to our starting position, is the correct move, queen e2, because now black has no choice but moving the king to the f file and then skewer, and then queen takes queen, white reaches a winning endgame. Well, I hope now you know a whole lot more about skewers, and when you get the opportunity, you'll use them. Thanks for listening, and so long until next week. Bye bye.